you got a Bible, go with me to Luke chapter 24. Luke 24, that passage we just read from a moment ago. If you are new, as Andy mentioned in his prayer, we are still towards the very beginning of a year-long initiative that we're doing as a church called the Year of the Bible. And the way it works is that during the week, Monday to Friday, we are spending time just reading through the Bible cover to cover, Genesis to Revelation over the course of this calendar year. That's what we're doing during the week. And then here on Sunday mornings, what we do is that we get together and we talk a little bit about what it is that we read the previous week, maybe some of what's coming up the next week, and really talk about some of the ideas at play in all of that, and hopefully start to wrap our minds a little bit around what we're reading, how to understand what we're reading, all of that stuff. And so if you are here for the first time this morning, welcome. We are so glad you're here. As Jordan said, we created space so that you could be here and find a seat to sit in. But if you want to hop in with us on the Year of the Bible, we would absolutely love that. You don't even have to play catch up in the reading plan. You can just grab one of the postcards that's at the info table on your way out, and you can just hop in with us tomorrow morning on Exodus 23. We would love to have you along for the ride. But this morning, what we're going to do in our time here is that we are going to wrap up our first sort of mini-series in the Year of the Bible, a series that we've been calling the Book of Strange New Things. And what we're doing in this series is basically just we're outlining a working definition of what the Bible is. What is this book that we're spending the year reading together? And we said back in week 1, kind of our summary of the whole series, is that the Bible is a library of books inspired by God and authored by humans, which together tells a unified story leading us to Jesus. That's kind of been our table of contents for these 5 weeks of this series. So today, we are going to zoom in on that final piece of that definition on screen, which is the idea that the Bible leads us to Jesus when we read it. What does that mean exactly, and how does that work? Those are the questions I want to answer this morning. And to help us figure that out, we are going to look at a passage in Luke chapter 24. So at this point in the story of Jesus, if you're unfamiliar with that story, Jesus has been crucified on the cross. He has been buried in a garden tomb. And as Callie mentioned last Sunday in her teaching, some women go to the tomb only to find that Jesus' body is not there. They encounter some angels there at the tomb that tell them that Jesus has in fact returned from the grave. But then the women disciples go to the men disciples and they tell them this incredible news, and the male disciples don't believe them, which cannot be the first or the last time in history that men have struggled to listen. At least that happens a lot in my household, so it's not unfamiliar to me. But they go to the tomb, they hear this news from the women disciples, and they think, oh, we've got to go see this for ourselves. So a couple of them try to go see if this is in fact the way that it's been described to them, if Jesus is in fact back from the dead. There's a foot race that ensues between Peter and John. John won the foot race. He really wanted to make sure we knew that, if you remember that from 2 weeks ago. But they arrive there. They cannot find Jesus' body. That's where we're at in the story of Jesus when this happens. So look with me, Luke 24, starting in verse 13. Here's what it says. Now that same day, 2 of them, that is 2 of Jesus' disciples, were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, where everything happened. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened, which was obviously quite a bit to talk about together. Verse 15, as they talk and discuss these things with each other, Jesus himself, as in the formerly dead guy until this point in the story, came up and walked along with them. 16, but they were kept from recognizing him as he did that. Verse 17, he, Jesus, asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these days? Oh, the irony of asking Jesus that question. I would imagine he's thinking to himself, I know a few things about what happened here the past few days. But he plays along. Verse 19 in the passage, what things? He asked. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. But, verse 20, the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped, notice the past tense there, we had hoped, before all of this had happened, that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. The Messiah, the long-awaited liberating king of God's people. And what's more, they said, it is the third day since all of this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body there. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. And so with that, Jesus kind of leans in a little bit on these two disciples. Verse 25, he said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Verse 27, and notice this next part here, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So notice a few things with me from this passage that we just read. First, the most obvious is that these two disciples walking to Emmaus do not recognize Jesus, as in his physical presence with them. And I'll be honest, I don't even fully know how that would have worked, how that would be possible for them not to recognize this guy that had been walking alongside of them for years at this point. Maybe it was some sort of supernatural thing. God just sort of spiritually blinded them to where they couldn't recognize Jesus' identity. Maybe Jesus was like super pale and looked kind of rough from being dead for 3 days. I mean, that's reasonable to think, right, at this point in the story. Or maybe Jesus was like wearing an ancient version of those glasses and big nose disguises from cartoons back in the day. Like maybe that was the deal. I don't really know how this would have worked exactly. But one way or another, they don't recognize Jesus even when he caught up to them and was literally walking along the way beside them. But second, the second observation from this passage is that the bigger problem is that these disciples are not recognizing the broader situation that they're in at this point in history, which seems to be even more important than whether or not they recognize Jesus. So somehow, despite the fact that Jesus told them repeatedly at this point that he was going to be handed over and be killed by the chief priests and the authorities, these disciples are still acting like that happening to Jesus is a complete and total surprise to them. Like they've never heard that warning ever in their life. In their minds, somehow that happening to Jesus means that he isn't who he says he was, rather than confirming that he was who he says he was. Which is especially baffling given that another thing Jesus told them several times while he was alive is that 3 days after he died, he would be raised to life. And apparently, even though some of the female disciples say that they went to the tomb and had that message confirmed by an angel and couldn't find Jesus' body there, seems like an important detail, right? The rest of the disciples are still unconvinced by any of that. So it is their stubbornness towards believing any of that, or really even considering it at this point, which draws such a strong response and rebuke from Jesus here in Luke 24. He says, how foolish are you? How slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Which, third observation, is an interesting way for Jesus to ask that question. Because instead of saying, hey, why didn't you believe me when I told you this was going to happen? Jesus actually says, why didn't you believe the prophets when they told you this was going to happen? Why didn't you believe the scriptures? Why didn't you believe the Bible of your day when it told you about this? Do you see that in his question there? Jesus' concern is actually centered on how the disciples did not believe what the scriptures taught about this moment in history. Jesus' conviction, it would seem, is that everything in the Old Testament has been pointing to, building towards, working towards what he would do, what Jesus would do. Everything in the scriptures had been teaching that this was the type of person the Messiah would be. This was the type of life that the Messiah would live. This was the type of death that the Messiah would die. So here in Luke 24, to help the disciples recognize that about the scriptures before Jesus even reveals to them who he is, his identity. It says he starts all the way back at the beginning. It says the book of Moses, which was a way of saying all the way back at Genesis. He starts all the way back at the beginning of the Bible and shows them all the things concerning himself. I would kill for a Bible study like that with Jesus. Wouldn't you? I mean, to have Jesus himself start at the beginning of the scriptures and show you all the things in the scriptures that are actually about him. For Jesus, it is incredibly important, arguably most important, that we understand how the entire scriptures point to him. And if we don't understand that, it is possible that we could end up being the ones who are foolish and slow to believe everything that they have spoken. To understand the scriptures, you must know that they, from the very first page, were meant to lead us to Jesus. That's what this book is about. So this week, before we dive into Leviticus next Sunday, Godspeed to us all, right? I want to talk in detail about how all of that works exactly. What does it mean exactly that all of the Bible leads us to Jesus? This morning, I want to take my best shot at elaborating on what Jesus did for these two disciples as they walked along the road to Emmaus. I'm sure it won't be anywhere near as good as Jesus' Bible study, but I'm going to do my best, okay? I want to talk about what that means exactly. Namely, I want to show you what I think are a number of different ways that the library of the scriptures actually points to Jesus in what it says. And I want to do that in hopes that as we read through the Bible together over the course of this year, we can make sure we are understanding the ultimate purpose behind all of it. That's my goal this morning. Everybody with me so far? Love it. So here's how we're going to break it down. I want to walk you through 5 different ways that the Bible leads us to Jesus. 5 different ways. I'm going to explain what I mean by each one. Then I'll show you a few examples of places in the scriptures where it does that, so you can see how it all works and hopefully recognize it as you continue to read through the Bible yourself. So, here are the 5 ways that the Bible leads to Jesus. First, the Bible leads to Jesus by foreshadowing him. By foreshadowing him. The Bible regularly alludes to the person of Jesus before he ever even properly arrives on the scene in the story. So the theological term for this, if you want to impress your friends and neighbors, especially if they're Bible scholars by some instance, the theological term for this is typology. Typology. People and even things in the scriptures that serve as types of Jesus before he arrives in the storyline, who's still to come in the story. So we see this for the very first time, for instance, in the Bible over in Genesis chapter 3, after sin enters the human story. And describing the consequences and responses to sin, God says this line to the serpent who represents Satan in the story. We'll put it up on screen. This is Genesis 3, verse 15. He says, quote, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, the serpent and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He, the woman's offspring, the human being, will crush your head, Satan's head, and you, Satan, will strike his heel." So most scholars agree that that is an allusion to Jesus and how Jesus will eventually deal a devastating blow to the presence of evil in our world through the cross. But that in doing that, Satan will also strike his heel, which is a poetic way of saying that it will happen through Jesus' death, through his execution. In other words, it will come at a cost to Jesus to do that. That's one way that the Bible foreshadows Jesus and what Jesus will eventually accomplish. So this past week in our reading plan, we actually read about several more of these allusions to Jesus. You may or may not have caught it, but let me just give you a list real quick. So there's the entire story that we read this week of the Passover in Egypt. that all foreshadows ultimately how Jesus becomes the true Passover lamb in the story. There's Israel crossing the Red Sea, which most theologians would agree directly foreshadows baptism, this practice that followers of Jesus participate in that represents Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. There's the manna that the Israelites eat in the wilderness that comes down from heaven, literally comes down from the sky, which Jesus later says refers to him, that he is the bread of life. He is the manna that came down from heaven. There's the rock that Moses strikes and the Israelites drink water from, which 1 Corinthians tells us later on foreshadows Jesus. It literally says, and the rock was Christ. There are all sorts of examples in the Bible of times that the scriptures allude to and foreshadow Jesus and what he would eventually accomplish on his people's behalf. And those passages are there, even in the Old Testament, so that we can understand not just the immediate meaning of them, the immediate context of them, but also the eventual meaning of them in light of Jesus and what he would accomplish. Not just so they can tell us what happened then, but also so they can allude to what would happen eventually through Jesus. That's the first way the Bible points to Jesus. Second way that the Bible leads to Jesus is this: by asking questions that only he can answer. By asking questions that only he can answer. Another way to say this might be by presenting problems that only Jesus can solve. So there were probably other parts of your reading plan this past week, if I had to guess, that felt a little bit unresolved, for lack of a better word, right? So think with me about Pharaoh's character in the storyline of the Exodus. So you read about Pharaoh over and over again, hardening his heart towards God and towards the Israelites in the story. And then the whole Passover thing happens, God brings his people out, and you're kind of just left going, man, that Pharaoh guy had some issues. He had some problems. And you're absolutely right, he did. Namely, he had the issue of his heart being so hardened and calloused by his sin, being so addicted to power and control over his kingdom, that he was unwilling to entertain anything that required him to let go of a little bit of power and control, like letting the Israelites go. But that story about Pharaoh is there in the Bible because it should leave us asking, okay, well, what could possibly soften a person's heart that has been that hardened and callous towards other people? What could solve that problem, in other words? And if you know the rest of the story of the Bible, that's the answer to that question is actually who? Who can do that to a person's heart? Jesus. Jesus can. So later in the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, it actually talks specifically about how God will eventually take away from his people a heart of stone, a hardened, calloused heart, and he will give them in its place a heart of flesh, a softened heart, a heart that loves the things that God loves, longs for the things that God longs for, which is a clear allusion to what Jesus will eventually make possible through his life, death, and resurrection, and by sending the Holy Spirit to reside in our hearts. In John chapter 7, Jesus actually says explicitly, whoever believes in me, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Jesus is who can change hardened, calloused, sinful hearts. Earlier this week in your reading plan, you read the story, or really the 14-chapter saga of Joseph and his brothers, right? The story just keeps going. And you think it's over with the story of, I think, Judah, and then you're like, oh, we're back into the story. We're back into Joseph now. So you read this story about Joseph and his brothers who were so jealous of Joseph that they pushed him into a pit, pretended he was dead, and sold him into slavery. And then, later in the story, they have to go find Joseph years later because their land was in famine, and Joseph had risen to power in Egypt and was the only one with access to food so that they could survive. And then this bizarre thing happens in the story where they go and find Joseph, and Joseph decides to forgive his brothers for what they did. And not only forgive them, he also chooses to care for them and provide for them in their time of need. And I think it's really easy for us to read that story if we're thinking about it critically and think to ourselves, what in the world would make a person respond that way in that situation? Like in what world can a person be that wronged for that long by their immediate family members and then decide to forgive them simply because they're in need of something that he has? Like, I think most of us, if we're just completely honest, we would say, that feels like the perfect time to hold a grudge, right? That's the human response. Forgiveness is not a natural human response to that type of situation, which raises the question, what would create that sort of response in Joseph? What would allow for that type of response? What worldview would lead a person to forgive his family for something like that? And if you read the Bible with the end in mind, with Jesus in mind, you realize the answer is, oh, Jesus makes that type of response possible. If a man later hanging on a cross could say to the people that put him there, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do, well, then Joseph can forgive his brothers for what they did to him as well. That's the type of worldview that would create that in a person. There are plenty of places in the Bible that point us to Jesus, that lead us to Jesus by teasing out problems, presenting issues that only Jesus can solve, questions only he can answer, situations that only he can remedy. Third, the Bible points us to Jesus as well, quite simply, by having him appear. Having him appear, like in the story itself. The most obvious way that the Bible leads us to Jesus is by having him show up in the narrative itself. So the clearest place to see this is obviously in the Gospels, right? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that are all about Jesus' life and ministry. He literally shows up all over the place in those books. This also happens in the early pages of the book of Acts, the last chapter or so of the book of 1 Corinthians that talks about Jesus' resurrection, and other places as well. But there are also other examples of times in our Bibles where, best we can tell, Jesus shows up somehow before he arrives on the scene in the story of the Gospels. So theologians will often call these Christophanies, meaning appearances of Christ in the Bible. So here's how it works, and fair warning, we are about to launch into like theological nerd level 1000 for just a moment. So if you're brand new and this is already overwhelming, maybe catch up on your email for a moment. I don't know what to tell you to do, but we're going to go into a little bit deeper waters here for a moment so you can understand how this works. Put on your thinking caps. The scriptures teach regularly that no one ever has seen or can see God himself. They teach that the only way for us to see God is to see Jesus, who Colossians calls the image of the invisible God. And yet, at the very same time, on multiple occasions in the Old Testament, people do claim to have seen God. So there's the time in Genesis 18, for example, where we're told that the Lord appeared to Abraham in the form of a man. There's Genesis 32, where Jacob wrestles with a man who he later claims was God. There's the passage in Daniel where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the blazing furnace and are not consumed by the fire because an unnamed fourth guy shows up in the fire and keeps them from being consumed by it. And there are a whole lot more examples where those came from. That's just 3 of them. So we have an interesting paradox here, right? On the one hand, the Bible says that no one ever has seen or can see God himself. But at the same time, it seems like a number of people do see God before he shows up as a baby in a manger in Bethlehem. So the only way that theologians know to make sense of that paradox is to say that the God those people were seeing in the Old Testament was a pre-incarnate Jesus. They were seeing Jesus before he was born as a baby to Mary and Joseph. And if you ask me to explain anything further about how that works, I will politely decline to do so. Because I don't know how it works. I don't know that we're told how it works. But it appears to have happened. One of the many ways that the Bible points us to Jesus is by having him appear literally in the storyline of the Bible, both before and in the New Testament. Fourth, the Bible also leads us to Jesus by explaining what he accomplished. by explaining what he accomplished. So after Jesus is born, after he lives and dies and comes back from the grave and eventually goes back to be with the Father in heaven, the vast majority of the rest of the New Testament just consists of people unpacking and explaining what his life, death, and resurrection were all about, what they meant exactly. So we see this in books of the Bible like Romans, which is a great example, just a full theological treatise on everything that Jesus accomplished and what it meant on our behalf. We see it in other letters like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, and so on. You'll find that these letters in the New Testament regularly just circle back to the life and death and resurrection of Jesus and elaborate on what those things meant and why they matter for us today. But what's interesting is that we also see glimpses of this one in the Old Testament. One really obvious example is Isaiah 53, which Callie mentioned last week in her teaching, right? So there it says this about a suffering servant who is yet to come. It says, "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. Yet he was pierced," look, "for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him," Isaiah says, "and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." So that's the prophet Isaiah explaining what Jesus' death would be all about, and specifically what it would accomplish for us, which is somewhat shocking given that he writes all of that approximately 700 years before any of it happened. It's almost like the Bible is inspired by God or something. If I didn't know better, I'd say that's probably what it was, right? That was sarcasm. I feel like I need to give that disclaimer. Somebody after the first service was like, "Were you for real? You don't think the Bible was inspired by God?" Yes, I do. Go back 2 weeks in this series, you'll hear all about it. That was sarcasm. Sarcasm is a love language here at our church. So what this means is the Bible is inspired by God. And on that subject, a lot of the Old Testament actually points to a conquering king known as the Messiah, who would eventually arrive on the scene in the future and set things right for the nation of Israel and for the entire world, who would bring about lasting peace and justice and righteousness in the world. And even though Jesus eventually does that in slightly different ways than everybody anticipated, those passages too are explaining or unpacking what Jesus would eventually do, what he would eventually accomplish. That too is part of how the Bible points us to Jesus. And finally, fifth one on the list, and then we'll come up for air for a bit. The Bible also leads us to Jesus by pointing to his return. By pointing to his return. So just personally, in my years of being a pastor and kind of existing within the modern American evangelical landscape, I've found that this one tends to be forgotten about a lot of times. We don't talk about this one as much, at least in certain church traditions. But beginning in the Gospels and continuing through the New Testament letters, especially in books like Revelation, the biblical authors talk a lot about Jesus returning to earth a second time in the future. And they tell us that when that happens, what he will do is that he will make all things new. He will set all things right for good. So remember that quote that we read back in week 1 of the series, if you were here for that, where Tim Keller said that the Bible is about how God both has come and will come to set things right. That's what he said the Bible is about. In other words, the Bible doesn't just unpack for us things that Jesus has done in the past, but also things that Jesus will do in the future. That he's coming back again. And even though none of us know when exactly that will happen, we do know that it will happen. And a lot of the Bible, not just the book of Revelation, talks about the day that that will occur. Isaiah talks about it. Hosea talks about it. Jesus talks about it in all 4 Gospels. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians talk about it. Hebrews talks about it. And yes, the book of Revelation talks about it a lot, which we will look at together for an entire month at the end of this calendar year. Feel free to be excited about that or nervous about that or intimidated by that, however you receive it, but that's what we'll do at the end of this year. But the point is that the Bible talks a lot about Jesus coming back again. It talks about the intensity of that day. It talks about the judgment and the justice of that day. And for all who call Jesus Lord, it talks about the hope of that day. For everybody who follows Jesus. And the scriptures teach not only that Jesus is coming back, but that a lot of how we live today should be guided and shaped by doing whatever we can to be ready for that day in the future. And part of how we do that, once again, is by familiarizing ourselves with the passages that allude to that day in the future and familiarizing ourselves with them. So to review, the Bible leads us to Jesus by foreshadowing him, by asking questions only he can answer, by having him appear, by explaining what he accomplished, and by pointing to his return. Now, with all of that unpacked, let's finish by asking and answering how all of this can help us with our daily reading in the Bible. Because while all that we've talked about this morning might be interesting or insightful to you, what I really care about is that it becomes practically helpful in how we approach the scriptures on our own. How it becomes helpful in our endeavor to read and understand and love the Bible. So here's what I'd say. Tomorrow morning, when you open up your Bibles to Exodus 23 through 25, I'm going to go ahead and let you know it's not going to be immediately apparent how any of that points to Jesus. At least not for most of us, unless we've spent a lot of time reading the Bible this way and we know what to look for. Exodus 23 through 25, if you're wondering, is a collection of miscellaneous laws about justice, laws about keeping the Sabbath throughout your entire agricultural operation, which is extremely relevant to us since we're all obviously farmers, right? It's about 3 annual festivals to keep with your fellow Israelites and how to keep them. And then it's a very spooky, mysterious-sounding passage about some type of warrior angel that leads the Israelites into a foreign land. That's what you're going to read tomorrow morning. None of that, for most of us, upon a surface-level reading, screams out, "There's Jesus. I see him right there. That was super obvious." But my hope is that by hearing what we've talked about this morning, about the 5 different ways the Bible leads us to Jesus, we can at least know what to look for in those passages. We at least know the questions that we're trying to answer. Namely, and I'll put these on the screen, these are just question versions of the 5 things we just worked through. I want you to ask the question as you read that passage, does this passage foreshadow Jesus? Does this passage prompt any questions that Jesus answers? Does this passage feature Jesus in any way? Like, does he show up in the story? Does this passage explain anything about what Jesus accomplished? And finally, does this passage point at all to Jesus' return one day in the future? Those 5 questions, I would argue, can help us read the Bible through the lens that Jesus gave his disciples for reading the Bible. But just in case that still feels a little bit daunting to you to do, here's what we're going to do to help. So this Tuesday morning, we are going to release another episode of our Year of the Bible podcast, where we've been diving a little bit more in detail to the things that we're talking about during this series. And in that podcast episode that you'll listen to, around the middle of the episode, we are going to walk through tomorrow morning's reading, Exodus 23 through 25, and we're going to use those 5 questions to answer how and if those passages point to Jesus. But listen, we're intentionally putting out the podcast the day after you're supposed to read it, because I don't want you to just listen to us do it. I want you to attempt it yourself. I want you to see if you can answer some of these questions. And I believe you can. So we'll let you attempt it tomorrow. And then Tuesday morning, if you want to check the podcast and see how you did, it's like checking the key at the end of the quiz, you can see how you did. And I'm sure you may even find things that we didn't even pick up on in those passages. But we'll do our best to provide some help there. Does that make sense? So Tuesday morning, be looking for the Year of the Bible podcast on our podcast feeds. With that said, though, if I can, I want to conclude this morning just by circling back to that story that we began with from Luke chapter 24. The story about the disciples not recognizing Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Because in that story, there was this parallel that was taking place in the narrative. And I don't know if you caught it. I tried to allude to it a little bit. But there was this parallel taking place in the passage. And it was between the disciples' inability to see how the scriptures pointed to Jesus all along and their physical inability to recognize Jesus as he walked alongside them. Did you see that? It was really clever on the part of Luke to have those two things happening parallel to one another. In other words, in the story, the disciples' inability to recognize Jesus in the scriptures in many ways prevented them from recognizing Jesus in their own life. Does that make sense? I point that out this morning as we close because sometimes I wonder if you and I have some of that same thing going on in our life, in our hearts, in our relationship with Jesus. I wonder if sometimes when we fail to spend time in the scriptures and fail to recognize Jesus in the scriptures, I wonder if that prevents us from recognizing Jesus at work in our lives as well. I wonder if it prevents us from seeing some of the things that the Holy Spirit is doing in us and around us and in the lives of others around us. I wonder if it actually prevents us from seeing some of the ways that he may be accomplishing things in the very midst of our present circumstances and situations. So, for example, I wonder if reading about how Jesus can soften hardened, calloused hearts like Pharaoh's can actually help us see how he might want to do the same thing in us or in others that we encounter who are opposed to the message of Jesus. I wonder if reading about how Joseph forgave his brothers for wronging him in significant sorts of ways could actually empower us to offer forgiveness to people in our life that have wronged us in significant sorts of ways. I wonder if reading about how Jesus showed up in the fiery furnace can actually help us see how he's showing up right in the midst of our present circumstances and situations right now. Listen, in order to see all of that, we have to continue doing what we've been doing all this year so far. And that is saturating ourselves in the scriptures and noticing how Jesus shows up there. But all of that said, here's what's so interesting to me about this story in Luke chapter 24. In that story, it's not actually Jesus explaining the scriptures to his disciples that opens their eyes in order to see him and recognize him. It does say that he explains all the things concerning himself, but even after he does that, the disciples apparently still don't recognize this man walking alongside them. Their recognition of Jesus actually happens later in the story. So if you still got your Bibles open, look with me at Luke 24, pick it up right where we left off in verse 28. Here's what it says. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther, but they, the disciples, urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And verse 30, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it and began to give it to the disciples. Now, real quick, when's the last time Jesus did that before his crucifixion in the story of the Bible? Anybody know? The Last Supper. So when he does it again here, when he does the same thing, when he participates in the same act of this meal with the disciples, it's something miraculous happens. Verse 31, then their eyes were opened, and they what? They recognized him. And he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? So here's how I'd summarize what we just read. The scriptures taught the disciples about Jesus. The scriptures made their hearts burn within them for the message of the scriptures, for the person that the scriptures were about. They made them desire a true encounter with Jesus. But the way that they encountered Jesus in the story was through a meal. A meal that in the story sure does seem like it's crafted to sound a whole lot like the very last meal that Jesus ate with his disciples before he died. The same meal that you and I and millions of followers of Jesus down throughout history partake in regularly, and we call it communion. And the reason that we call it communion is because it's through this meal that we participate in every week, that we, as the name indicates, commune with God. That we commune with Jesus. We take the bread that represents the body, the cup that represents his blood, and we meet with Jesus through them. We encounter and commune with Jesus through what he made possible on the cross. The same Jesus that the scriptures persistently testify about. So every week here at the gathering, we go together to the tables around this room, and we do precisely that. We don't do it as a cold, meaningless tradition. We don't do it as an empty habit. We do it as a way of remembering and recognizing and celebrating Jesus' very presence here with us. The presence that was made possible by his body and his blood, broken and shed for us so that we can know and live life with him. So if you're a follower of Jesus, you're invited to participate in that with us. If you're not a follower of Jesus, but you think you might want to become one, or you've got questions about what it would look like to become a follower of Jesus, there will be some folks down front with gold prayer lanyards on. They would love to talk and pray with you about anything that you want to talk and pray about. But this morning, what we're going to do as a church family is that we are going to commune with Jesus through this meal. And we're going to ask that he would help us to recognize him in the scriptures and also in our daily lives as we walk along our own road. Let me pray for us.